against humanity in Gaza. It also concluded that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but on an incomparably smaller scale, which is fairly straightforward. How many crimes can ants commit against a child, incinerating them with a magnifying glass? After the massacre in Gaza, as I mentioned earlier, there were many human rights investigations of what happened. The best known one was the one that was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council and was headed up by the distinguished, eminent South African jurist Richard Goldstone. Goldstone was the former prosecutor for the international criminal tribunals on Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And his mission produced a very substantial report. It ran to about 550 pages. And it concluded as follows: that Israel launched a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. A deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. Was the outcome of the attack the result of some soldiers who went berserk, some bad apples in the batch? Not so, says Goldstone, or the Goldstone mission. It says, and now I'm quoting it, "The systematic and deliberate nature of the activities leave the mission in no doubt. That responsibility lies in the first place with those who designed, planned, ordered, and oversaw the operations." Namely, what happened in Gaza was the premeditated, intentional result of what the military and political leaders of Israel wanted to happen in Gaza. And it was almost impossible to dispute the Goldstone conclusion, because the Israeli leaders, before, during, and after the attack, were very straightforward about what they intended to do, what they were doing, and what they did do. Before the attack, the head of Israel's Northern Command, he said, "We will yield disproportionate power against every village from which shots are fired in Israel. We will cause immense damage and destruction." The former chief of Israel's National Security Council said before the attack, "The next war will lead to intense suffering among the enemy population, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, and the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people." During the attack, Israel's Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, she said, "Hamas now understands that when you fire on Israel citizens, it responds by going wild, and that is a good thing." The day after the attack, Tzipi Livni went on Israel's Channel 10 News, and she said, and now I'm quoting her, "Israel demonstrated real hooliganism during the course of the recent operation, which is what I demanded." And then Ms. Livni, she was very perplexed. She went to the UK a few weeks later, and she was served with papers for committing war crimes in Gaza. And she was bewildered. She was completely disoriented, because she seemed to think that committing real hooliganism was protected by the Geneva Conventions. A former Israeli defense official said after the attack, "With an armada of fighter planes attacking Gaza, Israel decided to play the role of a mad dog for the sake of deterrence." A former Israeli security official boasted that Israel had regained its deterrence because, quote, "it has shown Hamas, Iran, and the region that it can be as lunatic as any of them." Lunatic, mad dog, real hooliganism. wild, intense suffering. What else was the Goldstone mission supposed to conclude, except that what happened in Gaza was intended to happen? Nonetheless, Israelis across the political spectrum were appalled, disgusted by this Goldstone mission. The president of Israel, who's supposedly a dove by Western standards, he called the Goldstone report a mockery of history. He said Goldstone was a small man, devoid of any sense of justice. And then he proceeded to set the historical record straight. So is there anybody here from the West Bank? Can you raise your hand? I know there are some people. There's a doctor here. Okay. So now he explains what Israel did in the West Bank. He said, Israeli military operations are what brought economic prosperity in the West Bank. Are there any people from Lebanon here? Okay, a few. So Mr. Perez, the dove, the Nobel laureate for peace, he set the record on Lebanon. He said the Israeli military liberated Lebanon from the wrath of Hezbollah. And then if there's any doubt about what happened in Gaza, Mr. Perez clarified, he said, our recent military operations enabled Gaza residents to return to their daily routine. The Israeli ambassador to the United States, a fellow named Michael Oren, some people think he's a historian, he said that the Goldstone report, and now I'm quoting him, was even worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers, which you'll have to grant is pretty terrible. Back in the United States, Alan Dershowitz of Harvard Law School said that the report is so filled with lies, distortions, blood libels that it could have been drafted by Hamas extremists. He said it recalled the protocols of the elders of Zion and that Goldstone was an evil man, an absolute traitor. As we know from the novel by Sinclair Lewis, every circus needs a clown. So, of course, Elie Wiesel joined in the attack on Goldstone. He called the report a crime against the Jewish people. Now, the obvious question is, what caused this hysterical reaction to the Goldstone report? The Goldstone report came after about a dozen other human rights reports, which are actually more condemnatory of Israel than Goldstone. Human Rights Watch put out 5 reports. This past week there was a 6th. Amnesty International put out 2. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a whole slew of Palestinian, Israeli, independent international reports. So why the hysteria against Goldstone?